Welcome back. I'm Professor Patel, and this is my introductory lecture to Francis Petrarch. Petrarch was born in the late Middle Ages. He was born 20th of July, 1304, in a place called Arezzo in Tuscany, which is now part of Italy. He died in 1374, so he died at the age of 70, with his head down on his favorite copy of Virgil. Okay, so Virgil was a big influence in Petrarch's life, and he had other significant literary influences as well. Even though Petrarch lived and died in the Middle Ages, he did everything he could to separate it from what he called the Dark Ages. He is credited with that term, too, the Dark Ages. So he was trying to distinguish himself from his own age. In this way, he was a trailblazer in the world of letters. He's considered the father of the Renaissance. He wanted something different than what he saw around him uh, in art and literature of his time. Just to give you an idea of the circles that he moved in, Dante was one of his father's best friends, and Petrarch himself was lifelong friends with Boccaccio, the writer who wrote the Decameron, among many other works. Both were contemporaries of Geoffrey Chaucer, although they did not mix, as far as I know. He started off studying law to please his father, but his interest was always in literature and the classics. And as soon as his father died, he decided to pursue the classics and pursue a life of poetry and letters. He worked as a diplomat for prominent European families. He took a lay position in the church, so this means he became part of the clergy, but he was never ordained, so he was not a priest. He did not take vows of chastity or any of those sorts of things, but he was considered clergy, lay clergy, they call it. And this allowed him to travel widely on diplomatic missions for the church. On these trips, he was able to search for lost classical manuscripts in monastery libraries. And if you don't know about this, in the Middle Ages, the monasteries, the Catholic monasteries, which housed cloisters of monks, are credited with saving a lot of the literature and knowledge of the time from being destroyed or lost. And it was kind of like a chain of hotels. If you were in a religious order, and sometimes even if you were just a good Catholic traveler, you could pop into one of these monasteries and stay the night. And if you were somebody like Petrarch, you would go to their library and see what they had and spend all your time there. There are even stories of some monks who could actually memorize entire manuscripts, stay up all night memorizing them, so that when they got back to their monastery, they could make a copy. Boy, our memories have really gotten skint since those days, haven't they? Now we have everything on our phones or tablets or computers. But the human memory is vast and can be very accurate. But there are what they call varioriums. A lot of these manuscripts that monks recopied have differences. Let's see. His greatest work is Rhymes Sparse, or what is called Scattered Rhymes, collection of poems he wrote and he revised between the years of 1327 and 1368. So pretty much his entire life he was working on these poems. In fact, he was editing them up until his death, really. He was still revising and editing them. And in this way, Walt Whitman is sort of a natural descendant of him, the American poet, Walt Whitman. Uh, the same thing. Leaves of Grass was his great work, just like Rhymes Sparse was Petrarch's work. And Whitman spent his whole life adding to, revising, and moving around Leaves of Grass. So you can definitely see the Petrarchan influence on Whitman. Shakespeare was influenced by Petrarch. In fact, the Elizabethan sonnet is, or the Shakespearean sonnet, as it's sometimes called, is descended from Petrarch's sonnet. Okay, even some pop lyrics have similarities to Petrarch. Petrarch is often credited with being the person to really record and I guess formalize, you would say, the anguish of love, the torment of love. We talk about love as being positive, love as being a great thing, but a lot of pain can come with love. And Petrarch is the first person to really formalize this into lyrics and make it kind of a genre. Okay, let's see. He is also, so he's considered of the father of the Renaissance, but he is also considered the father of Renaissance humanism, which differs slightly from modern day humanism. Petrarch's humanism, it involves a lofty conception of art, a taste for the good life, and a strong sense of the memories and glories of antiquity. So Petrarch is really interested in the Roman orators, interested in works like the Odyssey and the Iliad, the scriptures, Virgil, uh, Dante. All the even though he knew Dante as a little kid, uh, Dante also was drawing on the classics for his Divine Comedy, of course. So anyway, those are the three tenets: lofty conception of art, taste for the good life, strong sense of the memories and glories of antiquity. Some currents in humanism is that human action is not judged as right or wrong or good or evil all the time in humanism, but in terms of its present concrete validity, okay, and effectiveness, the delight it affords, and its memorability and its beauty. So that's human action, right? Human action should be known for its present concrete validity, meaning what's it worth right now? Its value right now. It's in some ways it's material value right now. In this way, it's similar to utilitarianism. What is it effective for? If it's very effective for helping human life, that's a tenet of humanism, right? It should uh, human action should bring delight, okay, and it should be memorable and beautiful. The goodness of life should be maximized as our time here is fleeting. So there are some similarities in this form of humanism to modern existentialism, right? Lots of people think, so say if a person is an existentialist atheist, they're going to say they don't care about other people. They don't want, they have no, say, empathy. But uh, some claim that existentialists are the ultimate do-gooders because if this is all there is, got to make the most of it, and you got to help people out. You got to make everybody have as good a time as possible. So you can see the similarities with utilitarianism as well. um, the Renaissance humanist was all about practicing a person's virtue, right? The competent and delighted exercise of one's skill or talents, right? Or living life to the best of your ability, right? The best of a person's ability. In this version of humanism, though, this is what the big difference between contemporary humanism is typically atheistic or agnostic in its outlook. Petrarch's Renaissance humanism still leaves a lot of room for God. You got to remember, these people are all devout Catholics, right? Petrarch was a devout Catholic, though he had much worldly ambitions. He was a devout Catholic, and he was influenced by St. Augustine and carried a copy of the Confessions around with him, along with his Virgil. In fact, he is credited also being the only person since Augustine who's known to write an autobiography. And Petrarch's was written in Latin and is called Secretum, sort of like, my secret ideas. So Petrarch is a humanist and also a devout Catholic. Now, something you have to understand about Petrarch when you read his poetry is Laura. Okay. And Laura is a woman that Petrarch saw in a church um, and fell in love with her instantly. And this is another similarity that Petrarch has to Dante. And perhaps he was influenced by Dante in this. Dante has a woman who's known as Beatrice. And Beatrice appears throughout the Divine Comedy. And he finally gets to see her when he gets to Paradiso, heaven. And Beatrice is sort of like the idealized woman. for Dante, and that is what Laura is for Petrarch. Uh, but there are differences. And also, I have to explain a little bit about courtly love. Okay, courtly love was a form of love in the Middle Ages. It sounds kind of crazy to us now, that involves the lover. So somebody like Petrarch, a poet, right? Uh, Falling in love with somebody, usually a noblewoman, who is out of his reach. Okay, and uh, this woman becomes the object of all of his love, of all of his poetry, of all of his devotion. However, the union is almost never consummated. Okay, so it's sort of like having an ideal woman, a muse, right, who's real. And there were doubts about Laura's, whether Laura was real or not. And I'm going to direct you to a passage that is in your text. And this was a note found in Petrarch's copy of Virgil, so his favorite book that he carried around. And it's about Laura. Laura, illustrious through her own virtues and longed fame through my verses, excuse me, first appeared to my eyes in my youth, in the year of our Lord 1327, on the 6th day of April, in the church of St. Clare in Avignon, in the church of St. Clare in Avignon at the Matins, and in the same city also on the 6th day of April at the same first hour, but in the year 1348, the light of her life was withdrawn from the light of day, while I, as it chanced, was in Verona, unaware of my fate. Her chaste and lovely form was laid to rest at vesper time, on the same day on which she died, in the burial place of the brothers Minor. I am persuaded that her soul returned to the heaven from which it came, as Seneca says of Africanus. I have thought to write this in bitter memory, yet with a certain bitter sweetness, here in this place, and that's in his copy of Virgil, that is often before my eyes, so that I may be admonished by the sight of these words and by this consideration of the swift flight of time, that there is nothing in this life in which I should find pleasure, and that it is time, now that the strongest tie is broken, to flee from Babylon. And this, by the prevenient grace of God, should be easy for me, if I meditate deeply and manfully on the futile cares and empty hopes and unforeseen events of my past years. A little bit about Laura there. So, some believe that she was not real. That's pretty passionate, huh? But most people think that Laura was real, and there is evidence of her existence, especially that note there. Most of Petrarch's poetry, one way or another, is devoted to Laura. Petrarch practiced courtly love with her. He had this devout passion and adoration for her that is chaste. In other words, it's never consummated. He probably never even touched her. He just saw her around. Uh, so he saw Laura in the church on that 6th day of April in 1327. So he was only uh, 23 when he first saw Laura. Had to do a little math there. So Laura becomes a poetic vehicle, she becomes a muse, and she also sort of becomes a representation of the tensions between Petrarch's spiritual aspirations and his earthly temptations. Sound like St. Augustine? Laura has similarities to Dante's Beatrice, as I mentioned, but as Beatrice remains mostly otherworldly beautiful, Laura is firmly anchored in the physical in much of Petrarch's writings. And here's another thing, too. When Dante finally meets Beatrice and looks into her eyes, he sees heaven. When Petrarch looks into Laura's eyes, he sees himself. Very interesting. In some of his poems, Petrarch uses wordplay on Laura's name, Loro, Aloro, right, for laurel, because Petrarch also has sort of an affinity or association with the god Apollo, who turned Daphne into a laurel. and wore the laurel as a crown. And the poet, and Petrarch was also a poet laureate. He was crowned poet laureate. Um, so he would wear the laurel's crown too. So Laura, laurel, right? The crown of the poet. Also laurel, gold, her hair and the measure of her value, right? And the Laura, L apostrophe, AURA, like a breeze or an inspiration, and also Laus, laud, praise. So I'm sure that in the Italian, many of these uh, become much more clear. Uh, Petrarch was influenced by Cicero, the Roman orator. He was influenced by St. Augustine, by Virgil, by Ovid, and he somewhat modeled himself on Augustine and carried around a copy of the Confessions with him as well. So very interesting, different take. He's sort of like Augustine with the Roman and Greek added back in. Remember, Augustine kind of was really down on classical literature because he thought it detracted from your connection to God or a person's uh, journey of the soul to God, right? But Petrarch doesn't have that problem. Petrarch wants to bring this stuff back. He writes Secretum, his autobiography, almost 1,000 years after St. Augustine wrote the Confessions. Um, there's also in one of Petrarch's poems, the song 264, he has a line, "I see the better, but I choose the worst." And this is so Saint Augustine. Um, I remember, I can't remember where it is, but somewhere Augustine says, "I see the right way, I approve of it, I take the wrong way," something like that. And that's pretty much what Petrarch is saying here. I see the better, but choose the worst, right? Isn't that all of us? So Petrarch's poetry introduces a new form with the poet's persona at its center. So instead of um, being an epic about Odysseus or about Aeneas, um, this poetry, the poet is sort of like the hero, and it's internal. It's a lot of what we would now call psychological investigation in the mind, and we see this now very commonly in poetry. And once again, you can see the Whitman connection. Leaves of Grass. Uh, the poet speaker personified as Walt Whitman is the hero of Leaves of Grass. Okay, so now and even though Dante is, and we can see the influence of Dante here as well, because Dante travels through the Inferno, through Purgatory, and through Paradiso heaven with Virgil, but Dante is really not central to that. It's not about Dante in some ways. Okay, whereas Petrarch style, it's about Petrarch, and it's more, I guess you could say, cerebral, physical, the mind, the spirit. So this style is introspective and self-fashioning. You're creating your character. This was a new thing. You are creating yourself as a character. The Renaissance person creates themselves. We still say that today, a Renaissance man. And this style spreads through European letters. Uh, the sonnet that Petrarch pretty much invented and formalized and perfected is now we call the Petrarchan sonnet. It's 14 lines. You get two 4-line stanzas followed by two 3-line stanzas. And it has the A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, C, D, C rhyme scheme. This form became widely used across Europe and preceded the Elizabethan or Shakespeare sonnet. So Petrarch, father of humanism, obsessed with Laura, uh, also called the father of the Renaissance. He was a product of the Middle Ages, but he transcended the Middle Ages and became one of the uh, ushers of the Renaissance. Thank you.